As you all probably know by now, Borderlands 4 has been announced. And I wanted to take today to talk about the top 5 things I want to see in the next installment of the Borderlands franchise. And yes, I do plan on covering Borderlands 4 pretty extensively as we get more information, so be sure to check back for more Borderlands news. Now, these are not really in any specific order, because in my mind, for a great Borderlands 4 experience, it's going to need to hit each of these notes a little bit. But if I had to pick something that needs to be there on launch, it would be functional loot. A game like Borderlands has always been about the loot inside of the game. Trying to get a god roll on that specific piece that will complete your build, and to have things to be able to farm for is the core essence of what makes Borderlands, Borderlands. But during the life cycle of this franchise, it's always been a bit awkward, what with many items just not having a farming location and forcing players to spam one enemy that drops world drops, or to just ask, I wonder if pearls are actually going to be in the game this time, or if it's going to be a part of a DLC 2 years later. It feels strange to include a new rarity system that just straight up disappears when the next game comes out and then gets added back in at a later date. As a player, this is a very disconnected feeling, because I know when Borderlands 3 launched, we were searching for pearls, only to be told they don't exist yet. I think it's too much to ask that they actually show up at the start this time instead of as a DLC later. In addition, I think it's time we add some new gun manufacturers. Yeah, I know we have our staples that we all know and love, but I feel like we didn't really branch out too much, nor did we fine-tune each of the elements. We just kind of stayed pretty much where we were. It just kind of felt the same overall. I know we did get Atlas, but I want to see new ideas for guns, because I feel like with an entire galaxy of planets they show off, we're really only touching the surface of what they could do. Continuing on with that theme, I would like to see elements actually be a bit more impactful, especially in the first playthrough. It feels like elements only end up mattering once we reach UVHM or whatever extra difficulty ends up being added in post-launch or something of that matter. And speaking of post-launch, I feel like a lot of the endgame content comes from post-launch content, with not a lot ready on day one, which is why for number 2 on my list, it's about raids and takedowns. Borderlands 3 had basically zero endgame content when it launched. Even after you had created the perfect build, there was nothing really to do with it. No raid bosses, no takedowns. There were a few arenas that you could run through, but those got stale pretty quickly with no rewards and kind of felt the same after every run. Has basically just been a slightly more engaging training range than anything else. So on launch, I'm hoping we see some actual raid content. I mean, Borderlands 2 had Vermivorous and Terra on day one. I don't think it's too much of an ask for Borderlands 4 to take a step up over Borderlands 2's launch in terms of content. I was a fan of the takedowns that they ended up adding in Borderlands 3, because I feel like that's the type of content that the Borderlands franchise in general was just kind of missing, which is a specific area to challenge the player and your build and make you question whether or not this is the right build for your character. What else could you try out? Maybe you need to go in a completely different direction, because these were more fine-tuned experiences, more actual like dungeons to go through, rather than a story area that you would just re-roll again and maybe there's a little mini boss somewhere in there. So I think the takedowns were really good. So I'm hoping that when we get to the launch of it, we're going to see at least one raid and at least one takedown. That would be nice for me. Personally, that's really all I'm asking for. Just a crumb of endgame content, and I'll be happy. Moving on to number 3. Now, I'm honestly going to only touch a little bit on this. It's about the story. The story in Borderlands has been all over the place. Borderlands 3 on launch felt like it rushed too much to get its point across, and BL2 honestly felt like it was just carried by Jack the entire time. So I'm hoping that Borderlands 4 finds the right pace of being able to have somewhat of a good story without taking itself too seriously. Also, please do not bring Jack back as the main villain, despite how much everybody wants him. If he ends up taking center stage again, I feel like it will just be forced and not feel authentic to the experience. If they are just going to bring him back in any fashion, just keep it to more background and additional story. Same goes with the other characters. I feel like they could add more detail onto the characters that we already have, rather than adding a new character every 30 minutes. That would just be the way that I go. I'm also hoping that we actually touch more on the Iridians in this overall war that they've hinted at multiple times throughout the series. I want to actually spend my time, actually hunting those hundreds of vaults that we see all over the galaxy. That would be fun for me. But at the end of the day, as someone who's always been more gameplay driven than story driven, if the story isn't that hot, it's not going to stop me from playing it. And with that, we'll move on to number 4. And I feel like it's time we talk about something that maybe not a lot of people think too much about when it comes to a Borderlands title. And that is balance. I know talking about balance in a game like Borderlands seems like a weird joke, considering just how broken Vault Hunters can become once they hit endgame and being able to destroy basically everything in sight. But for this, I'm referring to the overall vision that the devs want for each of the Vault Hunters. Back in Borderlands 3 launch, the balance was kind of all over the place, with some builds just being straight up trash and others able to dominate everything. Which, this is normal in an RPG. There will be good and bad options. There will even be a meta. It's the job of the player to figure out what works best for their character and the overall goals. But this didn't really pan out very well at the start. As we mentioned before, getting items for your build wasn't the greatest experience for Borderlands 3 on launch, with no spawn locations to farm your items, and this isn't something just for Borderlands 3. BL2 had this issue as well, and the pre-sequel. This was made worse by the fact that the devs had knee-jerk reactions to what was deemed okay in their game. I remember making multiple builds for Moze on launch, spending hours to get a specific item, and then being hit with a Nerf bat the next day. The funny part is that it didn't actually kill the build, and it still worked. I even ended up making a video on this updated build, and then it got hit with a Nerf bat again, and that time, it was dead. This kind of reaction to strong items feels like the devs didn't really understand where they wanted it to begin with, and would just nerf it to unusable status until they figured out where they wanted it, and then buffed it back up again at a later time. And then at some point, altogether just said, yep, it's good now, and just stopped. With many broken builds still being in the game and everyone's happy with it. I'm not asking for everything to get hit with a Nerf bat. What I'm looking for is just a smoother experience of how strong do you actually want us to be, you know? This means testing combinations of gear and going outside the box a bit to figure out what works and what doesn't before putting it in the player's hands. It doesn't feel too good to be an unpaid QA tester for balancing a game in its current state that it was in when there wasn't even anything to do in the game except find broken builds. Now, I know that Borderlands has a lot of different skills, guns, mods, whatever else they decide to add to the pot, and testing every possible combination is a time-consuming process. I would even offer to help QA test it. We all know I'm going to try and break it on day one anyway. But really, all I want is a less chaotic launch. That's all. And finally, at number 5, the last thing I want from Borderlands 4, and honestly, this one's probably the most important. I just want it to be a good game. As you can probably tell with how this top 5 has gone, I didn't have the greatest time with BL3 on launch. But I won't let that taint my experience of the 4th installment. And in addition, I plan on running through Borderlands 3 once again, through all of its DLCs and seeing what I missed, essentially, by kind of abandoning it. So I'll be going through that again. But I want to see what Gearbox has cooked up and dive deep into all the mechanics of the game, just like I did for Borderlands 2. That's all I have for this video. Thank you for watching and hope you enjoyed it. I plan on covering Borderlands 4 as we get news drops about the game and hopefully new guides for the 4th installment whenever it launches. See you all in the next one.